The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, welcoming you to another lecture on the second movement of Debussy's La Mer. Now, when we left off on the previous screen, there were a series of trills in the cellos, leading us inexorably downwards towards the root of the harmony on the next page, this E right in here. So, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the harmony just to frame it for you, but not get into it too severely. There are tons and tons of harmonic analyses out there of Debussy. You can go check them out for yourself. But just to observe, just in the context of this orchestration study, that right here the harmony is going to an E major 7 sharp 5, right? So there is the sort of perception of a raised fifth in this C natural, which could also have been spelled as a B sharp. Then that sort of resolves to a straight E major 7th chord. Of course, there's really more going on than that. The spelling here of C natural to B, G sharp, and then F double sharp, and so on, really suggests that Debussy doesn't really see the C natural as a raised fifth, but that is how you will process it as a listener. So let's just talk about the orchestration now. We've got this wonderfully mysterious opening as a new theme is introduced. This and notice how the A sharp in this melody suggests that this isn't really simply an E major 7th chord. It also has the implication of being E Lydian, right? We've got that Lydian raised fourth right in there. Once again, a very modal composition. Now, set against these trilling octave violins, we've got this great harmonization in the background behind it, right? So it's stacked C octaves, C, C, and then this is sounding C in the English horn. And that's actually a really, really great combination to put the English horn on the bottom of octaves with the flutes. This goes back to the bassoon being a really great partner for flute, whether it's playing octaves apart with the bassoon in its tenor register, or 2 octaves apart. So here we've got the best of both worlds. We've got a triple octave, so the English horn is contributing not just to the fundamental of the second flute, but also contributing to that flute's reinforcing of the flute above it with its body of tone. And then this is really cool in here, this little da-da-da, da-da-da, and it's coming in under the melody, right? So it anticipates the dip of the main theme right in here, while still playing a harmonic role. And it's just some wonderful scoring. If we were to really break it apart crudely, and just look at what's happening here, we would see, of course, a little punctuation at the beginning, a nice pedal E in the cellos, and the melody in the strings, and then, of course, the harmony in the winds, as I've already sort of discussed. So, really, octave Cs, and then we've got E and G sharp in the clarinets, and then an octave higher tracking from above. The first oboe is playing the same thing as the first clarinet. Very, very cool combination. Now here, we're going to old notation, horns, so that means that the sounding pitch will be up a perfect fourth, just like the F trumpet. So this isn't actually a B, it is low E. So here's an example of what I was talking about in the last lecture, which is the perceived necessity of doubling your low horns. And this is just a perfectly easy thing to play. And in fact, this could have been notated perfectly fine in new notation, but it goes just a little too low for treble clef. It's not the greatest thing to stay in treble clef and to notate below written C below middle C. Right? So I would say written C below middle C is kind of the limit on reading for your average section horn player. So go to bass clef, but notate in new notation, right? So in new notation, this would be a much more sensible looking B in the staff, sounding down a fifth to the E on the first ledger line. So here we have the horns very softly taking over from the cellos. And of course the cellos go into this really cool, almost piano-style arpeggiation with the violas taking over on the same pitches an octave higher in the next bar. And I really love the way that the winds play this stretched out octave, triple octave once again, counterpoint to what's happening in the main melody for the strings. And it's some really great impressionist style counterpoint. In little phrases like this, you can see the possibilities that were opened for a much more intensive contrapuntist like Lily Boulanger. This piece, I would say, is probably the most influential piece of orchestral music in relation to her own orchestral style. So things repeat again with a slight difference here. So after Debussy has committed the flutes to A2, 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 if you prefer, we've got the doubled flutes staying together, and the second oboe taking over the position of the second flute in the previous phrase. The English horn now doubling the second clarinet. The first clarinet doubling the oboe right in there. And then we've got these thirds right in here, which are essentially the same notes that were being played by English horn and second clarinet right over here. And, you know, listen to it, and there's hardly any difference between these two approaches. They both work fantastically well. But this just has a little bit more body of tone to it, right? It has a little bit more firmness and uses the ensemble a little bit better. Then, right in here, we see it's really just doubling what's going on in the English horn with the first bassoon. Now, I really love this right in here. Da 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 da. Very cool that Debussy does something that's similar to the relationship between these two little phrases. Almost identically repeating the same phrase, there's slight difference at the end. F sharp versus D natural. First in Debussy first violins, and then using both groups of violins. And this uses the natural tendency of Debussy violins to be a little less strong when you split them apart. Not half as strong as most people presume, and even some orchestration writers presume that Debussy violins are half as strong as when they are played in unison. And it's sort of true and it's sort of not. I've written about it in other places, so you can go look up some of that. But definitely it works in terms of balancing groups of instruments. Here, he wants a lighter touch on this octave melody because he is balancing it against this G sharp right in here, sounding G sharp, written D sharp by the cor anglais, and the first flute just lightly adding this little filigree on top, which in itself is a development of what was going on in the strings right in here. And this cool little accompaniment from below, tremolo, violas, and this same thing that we saw in the harps and pizzicato lower strings a couple of screens ago. That same plucking on every 3 eighth notes, syncopation. So very simple for the first 2 bars of this, and then the same thing is repeated more emphatically with the crescendo, and a slight development of where the harmony is going, with the lower note here rising chromatically, as you can see both in the violas and bassoons that are doubling those same notes. But here it's just an intensification of the right? It's just piling on. Second flute taking over for the first flute, with first oboe firming up that same line, and first clarinet playing exactly the same thing an octave lower. So it really does make sense just to use this easy convention. It isn't actually adding any more in terms of notes, it's just adding more in intensity and projection. And here we get to a very interesting passage harmonically. We started off with kind of nebulous chords based on E, and we've ended up with a bit of nebulosity on this screen based around B. Right? So it is kind of sneakily going around the corner to go up to the dominant of the scale. So that does have some relationship with common practice harmony, but the actual functional harmony that's overlaid is anything but common practice. So here we have this beautiful chordal glissando over a whole tone scale. So with a whole tone scale on harp, you always have to enharmonically double a string in order to get the correct effect. In this case, C sharp is being doubled by D flat. And then here we've got E flat, F, G, A, B, C sharp, and so on. So you can see it's a whole tone scale, but being played as a chordal glissando. Now, chordal glissandos are a little tricky to play for harp, but they have this beautifully magical effect. And I would say, because the whole tone scale appears to be completely equal across its scope, in terms of the relationships of the tones to each other, everything moving up in whole steps, it doesn't quite exactly work that way on harp because of the enharmonic string. But because of the perception of that, I think it is actually the most effective. I think chordal glissandos are a lot less effective when the harmony is more traditional, as in setting the pedals to a typical Ionian or Aeolian mode. There tends to be a kind of eclipsing of the sounds together into the perception of a glissando that is sort of all kind of crowded together, but not necessarily as precisely chordal as this. So I feel that this effect is used best right here in this piece. It's almost like using it up so that nobody else can do it afterwards, slamming the door behind him. Debussy almost never did that. Ravel would occasionally do that, use something so well that you just couldn't quote it anymore unless you were writing film music where nobody really cares, right? In the audience, they don't care if you're quoting this composer or that composer usually. It's great that there's a trade-off between the two harps. It's just a lot easier because if you don't do that, then one harpist has to sort of change direction and it's a lot less effective. It's really better to have this taken care of by two separate players, although there's nothing about the tuning or anything like that that really requires two players. It's more the ergonomic motion, right? It's just better for one harpist to sweep up and have their fingers set in that glissando position, and then the other harpist to just pick it up and roll with it. The other thing, too, is that the trade-off between the two harps is something that's magical in terms of the spatial reference for the audience. This is great, the little triangle ting at the top. And little punctuation at the bottom of our pizzicato at the beginning and end of these glissandos. And it just really helps to firm up those endpoints. Now notice the cello in here, just holding down this pedal B. As I said before, we'd kind of moved in a kind of sneakily common practice way from the tonic to the dominant. But notice the B in one long pedal tone underneath these two bars. Keep that in mind, make a little mental note of it, because when this returns, things are going to be different for the cellos. So after these sweeps, we get a reaction from the horns, and the horns are essentially playing in a whole tone scale. That is to say that the chords that they're playing are augmented triads, but they don't stay in the same exact scale all the time, because occasionally Debussy will cheat and go down by half steps back to where he was before. Like right here, this is a chromatic motion from this written D augmented chord, and then kind of cheating in a way. Here we have a C sharp augmented chord, which really means that this note should be a G double sharp, but it's just spelled a little differently just for convenience. Doesn't really matter. Then ending right back on the C augmented chord. So this chord in the middle is the other whole tone scale. You can only have two possible whole tone scales because of the way that there are 12 half steps over the course of an octave. And then he jumps to an E flat augmented right in here, which is part of that other whole tone scale, and then back to the original, ending on an F sharp augmented triad, which of course this should be C double sharp, or you could think of it as an inversion, with this being a D augmented inverted, right? So it doesn't really matter. I mean, let's not get into the harmonic niceties of it. What's really important here is to score something that is going to work for the horn players, and I think this works really, really good without getting into too many double sharps. Unmuted, first and second plus third in the middle voice. We see that happening again here. Almost the same notes as before, but reaching higher at the end. And here we get this beautiful chorale with all four horns, and these really brightly chirping upper winds right in here. This is very cool, the way that it works its way down as the horns restart on lower pitches, accompanied by the strings below. It's interesting how the horns give up their fourth voice in here when the lower strings are added. We don't really have doubling yet, though. We have 6 discrete pitches all working together. And then right in here, the viola starts to play the same pitches as the second horn. So we give up a voice as the music progresses. But it's all beautifully scored. It just works so well together. So many great ideas here. The horn chorale, the sweeping harps, the way that the lower middle strings work so wonderfully in sync with the soli horns, and of course, this lovely filigree from the winds. Don't neglect keeping an eye out for the bass line of the cellos and the motion right in here. This adds a little bit more context to the harmony that's going on in the horns right in here. And once again, it's just a lot to get into. You can go and check out the 2-piano score of this. There is a really great one on IMSLP that illustrates all this out. You can just kind of check out the harmony for yourself. But really, really cool first 2 screens. In addition to all of those cool features to observe, don't forget all of the things that are so extraordinary about this first screen in here. The octave motion of the theme and the strings right in here, going all the way through here to lighter Debussy playing by the firsts, and then more intense with firsts and seconds once again. The change of harmony here from augmented to just a straight E major 7th chord, but with a Lydian 4. And then the role of the winds in both adding a cushion of harmony behind the strings and then adding some counterpoint as the melody develops. And then I'll see you in a couple of screens. Let's study a few more pages before I knock off for this lecture. Right here at figure 21 is one of the most iconic passages in La Mer. Once again, an icon amongst icons. This and here is where triple tonguing is essential for these players. I think that this could actually be played single tonguing if the player is extremely careful. But definitely the flutist is going to take advantage of triple tonguing in here because it's just so easy for them. Just a quick note on harmony. Right here we've got a D-sharp ninth chord. And you can see that Debussy doesn't always really respect the way that harmony should be spelled out. Like, he's got what really should be an E-sharp marked here as an F natural, and what really should be F double sharp marked here as G natural. But that's okay. That doesn't bother me. When you consider it, the English horn is being spelled out enharmonically in its solo just for convenience's sake. Then here the harmony changes to an F sharp seventh chord. So you can see why Debussy is opting to stay in the key signature of 4 sharps and not just go to, say, 3 flats or whatever for the enharmonic equivalent of this chord, which would be much easier to read for everybody concerned, an E flat ninth chord. That way he can also stay with these A sharp thirds doing their thing all throughout this page. And the orchestration here is actually fairly simple. The harmony right in here provides us a little bit of a tone cluster. This F and G natural kind of stuck together. And we see those same seconds right in here, written as C and D, sounding F and G. So really the horns are having their harmony taken over by the violas right in here. And then the violas sort of progress to a more rhythmic function, which I'll discuss in a minute, when we go here and have the horns take over once again. So we have this kind of back and forth between violas and horns going on in here with our pad in the background. Then under this cool bolero-like rhythm, we've got violins trading off these thirds back and forth in eighth notes, with the firsts playing trills at the end of each bar. It's such a cool idea. And then, as I mentioned before, the violas come in here in pizzicato divisi, which is all pretty easy for them. Then we've got this lovely cascading background stuff happening here in the glockenspiel and the harps. It's almost inaudible, really. It's actually more audible, I found, in the Kaleidoscope recording than I've heard it with some major orchestras. Very, very well done. And while all that's going on, we have this great theme. Ba da 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 ba 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 da da. And at this point, the first horn comes in and plays. And here is where a very delicate balancing act has to happen, because the first horn playing up there on that F could easily just crush the cor anglais right in there. If I were scoring this today with my own particular approach, I would probably mark the horn pianissimo. But in this case, the horn player should be used to playing this work and should be used to blending rather than overwhelming the English horn. Now, it recently came up in the group. Somebody dug up a quote by Piston, which basically laid down a law, which is to not make any difference in scoring between the winds and the brass in terms of dynamic strength. But that is kind of assuming that everybody has time to work on the balance of your piece in rehearsal. And that is also assuming that all situations between the winds and the brass are the same. Now, in most scoring, where it's just pretty ordinary scoring with the brass being strong in the middle or doing what brass usually do in the middle and the winds are out of the way on top, and the strings are pretty well supported by other elements in the score, I would say, sure, of course, the brass should be the same dynamic level. But when you have really integrated scoring with the brass playing inside the winds and working with the winds and also working with the strings, then I would say watch out, because you only get one, maybe two rehearsals for your work. And if you don't take steps to control what's going on there a little bit, then there is a risk that your performance will be a little out of balance. That is not to say that you should constantly mark the brass down compared to everybody else, but it's just in certain situations, like the very delicate kind of scoring we've tried for the past couple of years in the Orchestration Challenge, Lily Boulanger this year, and then Mussorgsky the year before. There were a lot of quite delicately scored textures where people were taking the restraint of the brass for granted. So this opens out just a little bit, flurrying towards the strings, playing this great little break right in here. And there are some horns working together with this. So we've got first violin and first horn playing in unison on the first bar. But then the firsts and seconds rising above the horn as they continue. And the first horn going on to double what's going on in the violas. Slightly different pitches enharmonically transposing, right? Here, this G is interpreted as a B sharp sounding C, down a fifth from this G, right? So once again, the spelling is more for convenience than exact harmonic function. The third horn, on the other hand, even though it starts a beat late, is doubling the second violins at the beginning, right up to this note, and then takes over on doubling the cellos below that. And here, we just have a big harmonic cushion as the strings continue on. Now, notice what's happening here in the scoring of the horns. This is actually a very appropriate voicing to double the lowest note with the low horns, and then have the first and third playing thirds above that. I have a whole chapter in 100 More Orchestration Tips where I talk about scoring for three horns, or scoring horns in three parts. So when you have four horns, do you leave one out, or what note do you double if you are going to use all four horns on three voices? And this is a great way of dealing with that, because the projection, the force of the horn tends to lessen as the pitch drops. So that's one way of getting around that problem. And then, of course, A2 bassoons way down there on a low G sharp. This is really cool right in here, this Debussy keeps the motion going with little things like this nudging up in the cello line, little bit of arpeggiation right in there, and little flourishes like this. Even though there is a bit of a chorale going in here, he wants to make sure that the sense of play doesn't get lost in his lovely little chorale idea in here. This is really neat in here. Bump da da dum, bump da da dum. A little bit of a boom chuck happening between massive pizzicato strings and brass right in here, horns and trumpets. Keeping in mind that both of these instruments are F transposition, the trumpet is actually playing up here on a D, going D, E, D, whereas the first horn is playing an octave lower than the trumpet. As is this G right in here. This G is sounding middle C, This G is sounding C above middle C. It has a very, very clear sound with such simple harmonic elements. And some of these we see echoed in the winds as well, with the English horns essentially doubling what's going on in the first horn, and two clarinets doubling the first trumpet. Da 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 ya 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 ya. Very, very cool. And then this two flutes and oboes, basically ripping downwards on these Bs. A very, very simple idea. And it's cool how the first clarinet rips downwards along with all of these other instruments, right towards its destination. Now here things start to come apart a little bit, and I really love the freedom here as things are sort of tossed back and forth. Here we once again get to the fine line between programmatic descriptions and impressions. There still is the distance of this being the emotional reaction, the emotional impression of Debussy to what he sees out there in the waves, or even just in the ocean of his imagination. Notice how powerful this little idea is, these swirling rips going downwards in the strings, and then how delicate they are, continuing onwards. And then the contrast, harmonically, as this rips up a half step, changing context of the instruments to the flutes and oboes, with the first bassoon ripping up from underneath, and then the English horn taking over and ripping up from underneath, right to dovetail into the clarinet solo. That is such a cool idea. Really, really love it. From this point onward, with this solo, we are getting back into whole tone scales. B sharp, A sharp, G sharp, F sharp. And what's cool about whole tone scales is that you kind of can't go wrong with anything in your harmony. Any step along the way is as equally important or unimportant as any other. So the emphasis that you add to any particular tone is purely contextual. Right? With, especially in orchestration, the sound of the tone, the importance of it, its projection, its balance with the other instruments, its function on the page as a melodic or support element, and so on. Now this is not totally whole tone, right? We've got the whole tones of F, G, F, E, but then stepping down a little bit to E flat and coming back. I like the two different endings to the clarinet statement. They're essentially the same at the beginning of each pair of bars, but then the first time it's the horns that pick up where the clarinet leaves off, and then the second time it is adding a little bit of English horn down a fifth at the bottom here. Here the scale changes right on the second beat to C sharp, B, A, G. Then we've got a little bit more creative swirling in here. This is quite effective right in here. Flute cascading down, first dovetailing to second, and then the second dovetailing to harp, and then coming right back and zipping right back up again. So that is repeated in clarinets. Same exact pitches, same thing going on the harp, and coming right back. We have this sneaky little tremolo staccato going over a whole tone scale. Notice it's just a straight whole tone scale here. C, D, E, F sharp, A flat, B flat, C, D again. Same scale repeated an octave higher in the first violins. But all of this is kind of window dressing. It's sort of playful tossing around of little scales and so on, while there is this interesting rhythmic element happening in here. This is a cool little cluster of whole tones with middle C and sounding D above that, clustered together in first bassoon and first horn, and then second bassoon plus third horn, a whole step apart below that, on F sharp and A flat. And that beautifully backs up what's going on around it. As a conductor, I would probably discourage the players from pushing too much right in here. Just a little bit. Maybe up to poco piano. All right. Now notice the articulation here. This all works great. These are all diaphragmatic, right? As I discussed before in many evaluations in the orchestration challenges I just completed, that the staccato without a slur is played with the tongue, whereas the staccato with a slur over it is basically pushed by the diaphragm. And that's true of the tenuto as well. If you have a row of tenutos that have slurs over them, that is portato, right? So it has a kind of a dragging feeling. And you can combine these, portato to mezzo staccato. That's perfectly fine. So long as it kind of makes sense and you don't do something cute like going back and forth between portato and mezzo staccato over and over again under one slur. I would say that that's a little too fussy. But here it works really nicely. And the tenuto mark here gives the player a bit more than just a diaphragmatic push. It gives them some force that they can then cut off here with this mezzo staccato ending. This is actually sort of halfway through a new section of the piece, but let's cut off there, and that will give you some context for the beginning of our next lecture. In the meantime, have a listen to all those things we just discussed. This cushioning behind the flurry of notes being tossed back and forth. How the clarinet solo ends in two different ways, both of which give some context to the accompaniment in the strings. How effective these flurries are here in the strings, contrasted with a different pitch set in the winds, and then going to that different pitch set to accompany the clarinet. And then, of course, the introduction of those flurries right back here on this screen. And this boom, da-da-dum. Just the success of that, the wonderful changing of context. Triumphantly grounded with some very familiar harmony for the audience of that day. And how that is set up by this passage right in here with the strings. Listen for the horns right in there. And then this little filigree above the strings as they jump back and forth between these staccatos. And then, of course, all of the things that we discussed on this page. The little triple tonguing in the flutes. The cushion of horns back and forth with violas. And then all the little filigree over the top by the harps. And this great theme right in here on English horn. And then I'll see you probably in about a week for the next lecture in this series. I think I'm going to try to get through the second movement in pretty short order. I might do all of the lectures for that and then maybe wait until the beginning of next month to bring out the lectures on the third movement, which is really going to be a longer series of lectures. It seems like each movement gets a little bit longer and more intense in terms of how many score pages, how many things there are to discuss, and so on and so forth. The first movement is a total pleasure, and the second movement is a heroic struggle, and the third movement is a total beast. And I am up to the challenge. I'm really looking forward to it, but I do have to space out my time around other projects that are coming up, which, by the way, are part of what I'm going to share with the community in some hopefully constructive educational initiatives that I am about to release. So, with that cryptic comment, I will leave you to listen to this and to study that score, and I will see you soon for the rest of the videos in this lecture.